The dust from the stagecoach still hung in the air when Sarah Thompson stepped onto the wooden boardwalk of Telluride, Colorado, her carpetbag clutched tight in one hand and her traveling cloak gathered in the other. It was late September 1878, and the mountain town sprawled before her like a promise she wasn't sure she could trust, ringed by peaks that touched the sky and painted gold by aspens turning with the season. She had traveled for 3 weeks to reach this place, leaving behind the wreckage of her life in St. Louis, where her father's gambling debts had finally caught up with him in the worst possible way. The memory of finding him slumped over his desk with a bullet hole in his temple still woke her at night, her heart racing and her hand reaching for the knife she kept under her pillow. The men he owed money to had made it clear she would be paying his debts one way or another unless she disappeared, and so she had run as far west as the money in her mother's old jewelry box would take her. The advertisement in the newspaper had promised respectable work for a woman of good character at the Silver Bell Hotel, and Sarah had written immediately, inventing a history that painted her as a widow seeking a fresh start rather than a frightened girl fleeing the consequences of her father's mistakes. The proprietor, a Mrs. Hendricks, had written back with an offer of employment as a housekeeper and occasional help in the dining room, and Sarah had packed what little she owned and boarded the first train heading west. Now, standing in the thin mountain air with the September sun warming her shoulders, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Telluride was rough around the edges, a mining town that had exploded from nothing in just a few years, as silver drew men hungry for fortune into these unforgiving mountains. The main street was a mixture of hastily built wooden structures and a few more substantial brick buildings that spoke of permanence and prosperity. Saloons seemed to outnumber respectable establishments by a concerning margin, and the men she saw moving along the boardwalks had the hard, weathered look of those who earned their living by sweat and risk. Sarah squared her shoulders and asked a passing woman for directions to the Silver Bell Hotel. The woman, respectable-looking in a practical dress and apron, pointed her toward a 2-story building at the end of the street that looked well-maintained, with fresh paint and clean windows that caught the afternoon light. Sarah felt some of the tension in her chest ease as she made her way toward it, her small frame navigating around mud puddles and the general chaos of a town in constant motion. Mrs. Hendricks turned out to be a formidable woman in her 50s with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through Sarah's carefully constructed story. She looked Sarah up and down with an assessing gaze that made Sarah want to fidget, but she held herself still, meeting the older woman's eyes with what she hoped was confident directness. "You are younger than I expected, Mrs. Hendricks said finally, her voice carrying the hint of an accent Sarah could not quite place. "The work here is hard. The miners who stay in my hotel are rough men, though I run a respectable establishment and will tolerate no impropriety. You will have a room on the 2nd floor, meals provided, and wages of $12 a month. You will keep the rooms clean, help with the laundry, and assist in the dining room during meals. Sunday afternoons are your own unless we are particularly busy. Is this acceptable to you?" Sarah nodded quickly. "Yes, madam, thank you for the opportunity." Mrs. Hendricks studied her for another long moment, then nodded. "Come, I will show you to your room and you can settle in. Supper is at 6 and I will expect you to help serve. We have 16 guests at present, and most of them eat here rather than at the saloons, which speaks well of my cook's abilities." The room Sarah was given was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small dresser, and a single window that looked out over the back alley. It was more than Sarah had dared hope for. a space that was entirely her own after weeks of sleeping in crowded train cars and cheap boarding houses, where she had barricaded the door with a chair each night and slept with her knife within easy reach. After Mrs. Hendricks left her to unpack, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself a moment of exhaustion. Her whole body ached from the journey, and her mind felt scraped raw from constant vigilance. She pulled her carpetbag onto the bed and unpacked methodically, placing her few belongings in the dresser and hanging her 2 spare dresses on the hooks provided. At the bottom of the bag, wrapped in a piece of soft leather, was the knife she had taken from her father's desk after his death. It was a good blade, sharp and well-balanced, and she had learned to sleep with it under her pillow, finding some measure of comfort in the solid reality of its presence. She slipped it under the thin pillow now, smoothing the worn quilt back into place. The gesture had become ritual, a small act that told her body it could rest, that she had at least this one defense against whatever might come in the dark. That first night passed in a blur of new faces and new routines. The dining room was indeed full of miners, men who ate with single-minded focus and spoke little beyond grunted thanks when Sarah refilled their coffee or brought fresh bread to the table. She moved among them with her eyes down and her manner efficient, drawing no attention to herself beyond what was necessary. Mrs. Hendricks watched her work with that same assessing gaze, but when the last dish was washed and the kitchen cleaned for the night, she gave Sarah a short nod that felt like approval. "You will do," she said simply. "Get some rest. Breakfast begins at 5:30. Sarah climbed the stairs to her small room, feeling the weight of the day in every muscle. She washed her face and hands in the basin, changed into her nightgown, and checked that the knife was where she had left it before climbing into bed. The mattress was thin, but the sheets were clean, and she fell asleep almost immediately, too exhausted even for nightmares. The days that followed took on a rhythm. Sarah rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast, spent the morning cleaning rooms and changing linens, helped with the midday meal, spent the afternoon doing laundry or mending, helped with supper, and fell into bed each night too tired to think. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done in her previous life as the pampered daughter of a merchant who had seemed prosperous until his death revealed the truth. But there was something satisfying about the physicality of it, the way her body grew stronger and her hands grew calloused. Here, she earned her keep honestly, and no one asked questions about her past or looked at her with the calculating speculation that had filled her with dread in St. Louis. Telluride itself was a revelation. The town sat in a box canyon surrounded by mountains that seemed to scrape the sky, their peaks already dusted with early snow that would only deepen as winter approached. The air was thin and crisp, so different from the heavy humidity of Missouri that Sarah felt like she was breathing for the first time in years. The town was loud and rough, full of miners and merchants, and the occasional cowboy driving cattle through on their way to winter pastures. But there was also an energy to it, a sense that anything was possible for those brave or foolish enough to take the risk. She learned the rhythms of the place through observation, and through the conversations she overheard while serving meals. The mines were producing well, particularly the Smuggler and the Union, and more men arrived every week hoping to strike it rich. The town was growing so fast that buildings seemed to spring up overnight, and there was talk of bringing in a railroad spur that would connect Telluride to the rest of the world more reliably than the rough roads that were the only access now. It was nearly 2 weeks after her arrival that Sarah first saw Russell Wade. She was in the dining room setting tables for the evening meal when she heard the front door open and Mrs. Hendricks's voice greeting someone with unusual warmth. Curious despite herself, Sarah glanced up and saw a man standing in the doorway, hat in hand, speaking with the proprietor. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders, and the lean, muscular build of someone who spent their days doing hard physical work. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and fell a bit too long around a face that was tanned and weathered but undeniably handsome, with strong features and eyes that even from a distance looked kind. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy, durable denim pants, and a worn cotton shirt under a leather vest, scuffed boots and a bandana tied loosely around his neck. His hat was battered Stetson that had seen better days, and when he shifted his weight, she caught sight of a revolver at his hip, worn with the casual ease of someone who knew how to use it but did not feel the need to advertise the fact. "Russell, it is good to see you," Mrs. Hendricks was saying. "Will you be staying with us for a while?" "Yes, madam," the man replied, his voice a deep baritone with a hint of Texas drawl that made Sarah's stomach do an unexpected flip. "I've got work lined up with the Gunnison Cattle Company for the next few months, bringing their herd down from the high country before the snow gets too deep. Figured I would take a room here rather than sleeping in the bunkhouse if you have got space." "For you, I always have space, Mrs. Hendricks said warmly. "You want your usual room? That would be fine, thank you." Sarah ducked her head and returned her attention to the silverware she was arranging, but she felt hyper-aware of the man's presence as Mrs. Hendricks led him past the dining room toward the stairs. He glanced her way as he passed, and their eyes met for just a moment. His were hazel, she realized, a striking mix of green and gold that stood out against his tanned skin, and there was something in his expression, a quiet steadiness, that made her breath catch before she quickly looked away. She told herself firmly that she had no business noticing any man, let alone a cowboy who was probably just passing through. She was here to work, to save money, to build a life where she did not have to be afraid all the time. Getting distracted by a handsome face was the last thing she needed. But when Russell Wade came down for supper that evening and took a seat at one of her tables, she could not help the way her pulse quickened as she approached to take his order. Up close, he was even more striking, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, and a small scar on his chin that spoke of a life not without its dangers. "Good evening," she said, proud that her voice came out steady and professional. "What can I get for you tonight?" He looked up at her with those remarkable eyes and gave her a slow smile that transformed his whole face. "Good evening, miss. What would you recommend?" "The roast beef is very good," she said, "and the cook made apple pie this afternoon." "That sounds perfect," he said. "I will have the roast beef and whatever comes with it, and coffee, please." "Yes, sir," she said, and fled to the kitchen before she could do something foolish like keep standing there staring at him. She served him efficiently, refilling his coffee once and bringing him a generous slice of pie without being asked, and if she was aware of his gaze following her as she moved around the room, she told herself she was imagining it. When he left, he thanked her politely and left a coin on the table that was more generous than necessary. Sarah pocketed it quickly, feeling her cheeks warm for reasons she did not want to examine. Over the days that followed, Russell Wade became a regular presence at the Silver Bell Hotel. He took his meals there, though his work with the Gunnison Cattle Company kept him out from dawn until well after dark most days. Sarah learned through overheard conversations that he was well respected in the area, known as an honest man and a skilled cattleman who could be counted on to get a job done right. He had worked for various ranches throughout Colorado and Utah for the past several years, and he returned to Telluride regularly because he liked the town and Mrs. Hendricks, who had apparently known his mother years ago in Texas. Sarah tried not to pay him any particular attention, but it was difficult when he seemed determined to seek her out. He always chose one of her tables when he ate in the dining room, always had a kind word or a smile for her. And once, when she was struggling to carry a heavy tray of dishes, he appeared at her elbow and took it from her hands before she could protest, carrying it to the kitchen and setting it down gently before tipping his hat to her and disappearing back to his meal. "He is a good man, that one," Mrs. Hendricks said, appearing at Sarah's shoulder and making her jump. "Honest and hardworking, not like some of the men around here who are only interested in quick money and quicker women." Sarah felt her face heat. "I had not noticed particularly," she lied, "Mrs." Hendricks made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Of course not, but if you had noticed, you could do far worse. Now the gentlemen at table 4 are looking impatient, and we do not keep guests waiting." Sarah hurried to attend to table 4, but Mrs. Hendricks's words stayed with her, both comforting and unsettling. She was not ready to trust anyone, not ready to let anyone close enough to hurt her or discover the truth about why she had come here. But there was something about Russell Wade that drew her despite her determination to keep everyone at arm's length. Something warm and solid and safe that made her feel like she could breathe a little easier when he was near. It was late October, nearly 6 weeks after Sarah's arrival in Telluride, when everything changed. She had been cleaning the rooms on the second floor, working her way methodically from one end of the hall to the other. Most of the guests were out for the day, either working in the mines or attending to business in town, and the hotel was quiet except for the sound of her movements and the occasional creak of the old building settling. She had just finished changing the linens in room 7 when she heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up to see Russell Wade standing in the doorway of his room across the hall, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. She straightened quickly, suddenly aware that they were alone on the floor and that her hair had come partially loose from its pins, falling in wisps around her face. "I apologize," she said quickly. "I did not realize you were here. I can come back later to clean your room." "No need to apologize," he said easily. "I just came back to grab some tools I forgot this morning. I will be out of your way in a minute." He disappeared into his room, and Sarah returned her attention to gathering the dirty linens, her heart beating faster than it should. She heard him moving around, the sound of a drawer opening and closing, and then he emerged with a coil of rope over his shoulder and a leather tool bag in one hand. He paused in the doorway again, and Sarah felt his gaze on her, even though she kept her eyes firmly on her work. "Miss Thompson," he said, and she looked up despite herself at the sound of her name in his deep voice. "I hope I am not being too forward, but I wanted to say that I think you are doing a fine job here. Mrs. Hendricks speaks highly of you, and that is not something she does lightly." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you," she said softly. "That is kind of you to say." He smiled, that slow, warm smile that made something flutter in her stomach. "Just speaking the truth. I hope you are settling in well to Telluride. I know it can be a rough place for newcomers, especially for a lady on her own." There was something in the way he said it, a gentleness and concern that was not pushy or intrusive, just genuinely kind. Sarah found herself relaxing slightly, her usual wariness easing just a fraction. "I am managing well enough," she said. "Everyone has been very welcoming." "Good," he said, and seemed to mean it. "Well, I should get back to work. Have a good rest of your day, Miss Thompson. You as well, Mr. Wade." He tipped his hat to her and headed down the stairs, his footsteps fading as he left the hotel. Sarah stood in the hallway for a long moment, her arms full of soiled linens, feeling strangely off balance. There had been nothing improper in the exchange, nothing she could point to as concerning, but she felt as though something had shifted, as though a door she had been keeping firmly closed had opened just a crack. That evening, when Russell came in for supper, he caught her eye across the dining room and smiled, and Sarah found herself smiling back before she could think better of it. The days grew shorter and colder as October gave way to November. Snow dusted the peaks surrounding Telluride and occasionally drifted down into the town itself, melting on the warmer ground but leaving everything feeling crisp and clean. Sarah had been in Telluride for nearly 3 months now, and the town was starting to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like something that might actually be home. She had made a few tentative friendships among the other women who worked in the town's respectable establishments. There was Mary, who worked at the general store and had a sharp wit that made Sarah laugh, and Catherine, the schoolteacher, who was only a few years older than Sarah and had come west from Boston to escape her own complicated past. They sometimes took their Sunday afternoons together, walking along the river that ran through the canyon, or having tea at the small cafe that had opened near the assay office. But it was Russell Wade who occupied more and more of Sarah's thoughts, no matter how firmly she told herself that she had no business thinking about any man. He was unfailingly polite and kind, never overstepping boundaries, but always finding small ways to interact with her. He held doors for her, carried heavy things without being asked her opinion on trivial matters like whether he should order the chicken or the beef, and always looked at her like she was someone worth looking at, someone interesting and valuable rather than just a servant going about her duties. Sarah found herself looking forward to mealtimes, to the moments when he would come into the dining room, and she would have an excuse to talk to him, even if just to take his order or refill his coffee. It was mid-November when he finally asked her to take a walk with him. She was clearing tables after the supper rush, most of the guests having retired to their rooms or headed out to the saloons for the evening, when Russell approached her with an expression that was half hopeful and half nervous. "Miss Thompson," he said, turning his hat in his hands in a gesture she was coming to recognize as a sign of uncertainty. "I was wondering if you might have some time on your next afternoon off to take a walk with me. I know a trail up into the canyon that has a beautiful view of the aspen groves, and the weather is supposed to be fine this Sunday." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat behind the walls she had built so carefully. But she found herself hesitating, looking at his honest face and kind eyes and thinking about how lonely she had been, how exhausting it was to keep everyone at a distance all the time. "I would like that," she heard herself say, and felt equal parts terror and excitement at the words. His face lit up with a smile that was so genuine it made her heart ache. "That is wonderful. Shall we say 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon? I will meet you here." 2 o'clock, she agreed, and watched him walk away feeling like she had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to see if she would fall or fly. Sunday afternoon arrived cold and clear, the sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it. Sarah dressed carefully in her best dress, a dark green wool that she had made herself before leaving St. Louis, and her warmest cloak. She brushed her hair until it shone and pinned it up carefully, studying her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Her face looked back at her, young and uncertain, her dark eyes too large in her pale face, her mouth drawn tight with nervousness. She thought about the knife under her pillow, the habit of a lifetime of fear and caution. For a moment, she considered slipping it into her pocket, but something made her stop. Russell Wade was not a threat. Every instinct she had told her that, every interaction they had shared. And if she was going to take this step, to open herself up even a little, she needed to do it fully, not with one hand already reaching for a weapon. She left the knife where it was and went downstairs to find Russell waiting in the lobby, looking handsome and slightly uncomfortable in clothes that were clearly his best, clean denim, and a shirt that looked new, his hair neatly combed and his boots polished. He stood when he saw her, his face breaking into that warm smile. "You look lovely," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. "Thank you," she said. "You look very nice as well." They left the hotel together, and Sarah was acutely aware of the curious glances from people they passed. Telluride was a small town despite its rapid growth, and everyone noticed everyone's business. But Russell seemed unconcerned, walking beside her with an easy confidence that helped settle her nerves. He led her to a trail that wound up the side of the canyon, not too steep, but enough to make her breathing quicken in the thin air. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the sound of the river below them and the wind in the pine trees the only accompaniment. The aspens Russell had mentioned stood in golden groves against the dark green of the conifers, their leaves turning the hillsides into something that looked like it had been touched by Midas. "I never get tired of this view," Russell said as they reached a flat outcropping of rock that provided a perfect vantage point over the canyon. "Every time I come back to Telluride, this is the first place I visit. It reminds me why I love this country so much, despite how hard it can be sometimes." Sarah looked out over the vista, the town spread below them like a collection of toys, the mountains rising all around in magnificent indifference to the human activity at their feet. "It is beautiful," she said softly, "so different from Missouri." "Is that where you are from?" Russell asked. "Missouri?" Sarah tensed, but his tone was curious rather than prying. She had known this would come eventually, the questions about her past, and she had prepared an answer that was true enough without being the whole truth. "St. Louis," she said. "I came west after my father passed away. There was nothing left for me there." "I am sorry for your loss," Russell said, and the sympathy in his voice sounded genuine. "That must have been very difficult to lose your father and uproot your whole life at the same time." Sarah nodded, looking down at her hands. "It was. But it also felt like an opportunity in a way, a chance to start fresh somewhere new." "I understand that feeling," Russell said. He was quiet for a moment, then continued, "I left Texas when I was 18. My father wanted me to take over the family ranch, but we did not see eye to eye on much of anything, especially how he treated the ranch hands and the neighboring Mexican families whose land he was always trying to acquire through less than honest means. I told him I wanted no part of it, and he told me if I left I should not bother coming back. So I left, and I have not been back since." Sarah looked up at him, surprised by the admission. "Do you regret it?" He thought about that, his gaze distant. "Sometimes I regret how it happened, the things that were said. But I do not regret leaving. I would rather make my own way honestly than build something on a foundation of other people's suffering. I have worked hard for everything I have, and I can sleep at night knowing I did not cheat or steal or harm anyone to get it." There was something in the way he said it, a quiet pride and integrity that made Sarah's chest feel tight. She thought about her father, about the gambling and the debts, and the way he had slowly destroyed everything her mother had worked for before her death. And she felt a fierce longing to be able to say the same thing, to build something good and honest from the wreckage she had inherited. "That is admirable," she said quietly. "Integrity is not always easy to maintain." "No," Russell agreed, "but it is worth it. At least, that is what I tell myself when I am sleeping on hard ground in a rainstorm and wondering if I should have just swallowed my pride and stayed home." Sarah laughed despite herself, and the sound surprised her. She could not remember the last time she had laughed genuinely, without the brittleness of fear underneath. Russell smiled at her, clearly pleased to have amused her. And in that moment, Sarah felt something inside her chest crack open just a little, letting in a sliver of light. They talked for a long time on that rocky outcropping, the conversation flowing more easily than Sarah had expected. Russell told her about his work, about the challenges of moving cattle through mountain terrain, and the satisfaction of bringing a herd safely through to winter pastures. He told her funny stories about stubborn steers and green ranch hands, about nights spent under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, about the raw beauty and harsh realities of the life he had chosen. Sarah found herself sharing more than she had intended, talking about her mother who had died when she was 12, about the books she loved to read, about how strange and wonderful it was to live in these mountains after a lifetime in a flat river city. She did not talk about her father's death or the reasons she had fled, but Russell did not press, seeming content to learn about her through the things she was willing to share. When the sun started to sink lower in the sky and the air grew noticeably colder, Russell reluctantly suggested they head back. They walked down the trail together, closer now than they had been on the way up, their hands occasionally brushing in a way that made Sarah's heart race. At the door of the Silver Bell Hotel, Russell stopped and turned to face her, his expression serious. "I really enjoyed this afternoon, Miss Thompson. I hope we can do it again sometime." "I enjoyed it too," Sarah said, and meant it completely. "And please call me Sarah." His smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Sarah, that is a beautiful name, and you should call me Russell, not Mr. Wade. Mr. Wade makes me sound like my father, and I would rather we not have that association." Sarah smiled. "Russell, then." He reached out and took her hand, holding it gently for just a moment. "Good evening, Sarah. I will see you at breakfast." "Good evening, Russell." She watched him walk away toward the livery stable where he kept his horse, then went inside feeling like she was floating. Mrs. Hendricks was in the kitchen supervising the preparation of the evening meal, and she looked up when Sarah entered with an expression that was far too knowing. "You had a good walk, I see," she said, not making it a question. "Yes," Sarah said, unable to keep the smile off her face. "A very good walk." Mrs. Hendricks nodded, looking satisfied. "Good. Now go wash up and help with the supper service. Just because you have been out enjoying yourself does not mean the work stops." But there was no bite to the words, and Sarah hurried to comply, feeling lighter than she had in months. Over the weeks that followed, Sarah and Russell spent more and more time together. He would wait for her after the supper service, and they would walk through the town in the early evening, talking about everything and nothing. On her Sunday afternoons off, they would take longer walks or sometimes just sit in the hotel's small parlor when the weather was too cold, playing chess or reading while simply enjoying each other's company. Sarah found herself opening up in ways she had not thought possible, sharing pieces of herself she had kept carefully hidden. Russell was easy to talk to, a good listener who did not judge or press for more than she was willing to give. And slowly, carefully, she began to trust him in a way she had not trusted anyone since her mother died. Russell, for his part, seemed to be falling for her just as hard. He looked at her like she was something precious, and he found endless small ways to show his care. He brought her little gifts, nothing expensive or improper, but thoughtful things like a book he thought she would enjoy or a pretty ribbon from the general store. He made her laugh with his dry wit and gentle teasing. He was endlessly patient with her moments of nervousness or withdrawal, never pushing but always there, steady and reliable as the mountains themselves. It was early December, the town blanketed in snow and the peaks surrounding them invisible in the low clouds, when they shared their first kiss. They had been walking along the river despite the cold, bundled in heavy coats and scarves, their breath making clouds in the frigid air. Sarah had slipped on a patch of ice and Russell had caught her, his arms strong and sure around her waist, and when she looked up at him, their faces were so close that kissing him seemed like the most natural thing in the world. His lips were cold at first but warmed quickly, and the kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise and hope. When they pulled apart, Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that she was happy, truly happy, for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Sarah," Russell said softly, his hand still on her waist, his forehead resting against hers. "I am falling in love with you. I know we have not known each other long, but I have never felt this way about anyone before. You are brave and kind and beautiful, and I want to be worthy of you." Sarah's breath caught. She wanted to tell him he was already worthy, that he was the best man she had ever known, but fear held her tongue. There were still things he did not know about her, secrets she had not shared. What if the truth changed how he felt? What if he looked at her differently when he knew she had lied about being a widow, that she was just a frightened girl running from her father's debts and the men who would have used her to pay them? But looking into his eyes, seeing the honesty and vulnerability there, she could not bring herself to pull away. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. They walked back to the hotel hand in hand, and at the door Russell kissed her again, longer this time with more passion but still respectful, still careful. "Good night, Sarah. Sleep well." "Good night, Russell." Sarah climbed the stairs to her room feeling like her heart was too full for her chest. She prepared for bed in a daze, washing her face and changing into her nightgown, moving through the familiar motions while her mind replayed every moment of the kiss, of Russell's declaration, of her own admission of love. She pulled back the covers and reached under the pillow for her knife, the gesture so automatic she barely registered it, but when her fingers closed around the leather-wrapped handle she hesitated. She pulled the knife out and looked at it, this thing that had been her security and her comfort for months, and felt a strange disconnect. The fear that had driven her to sleep with a weapon within reach every night seemed distant now, pushed back by something bigger and brighter. She was still holding the knife, uncertain what to do with it when she heard a soft knock at her door. Her heart jumped, and for a moment the old fear returned, but then Russell's voice came quietly through the wood. "Sarah, I am sorry to bother you. I saw your light was still on. I forgot to tell you something." She set the knife on the bed and opened the door, finding Russell in the hallway looking apologetic. He was still fully dressed, clearly having not yet gone to his own room. "I am sorry," he said again. "I know it is not proper for me to be here, but I wanted to ask if you would join me tomorrow evening for supper at the cafe. I want to take you somewhere nice, not just the hotel dining room." Sarah smiled, her heart warming at his nervousness. "I would like that very much." His face lit up. "Good. Wonderful. I will come by after you finish work." His gaze shifted past her shoulder and his expression changed, becoming concerned. He was looking at the bed, and Sarah realized with a jolt that the knife was clearly visible on the white sheets, its presence stark and impossible to explain away. Russell's eyes came back to her face, and she saw questions there but also something else, a sadness that made her stomach twist. He stepped forward slightly, still in the doorway, his voice very gentle when he spoke. "Sarah, may I come in? Just for a moment. I promise I will leave the door open and this will be entirely proper." Sarah nodded, stepping back to let him enter. He moved into the small room and picked up the knife carefully, examining it with the eye of someone who understood weapons. When he looked at her again, his expression was so full of understanding and compassion that Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. "You sleep with this under your pillow," he said, not making it a question. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Russell set the knife down on the dresser very deliberately and then took both of her hands in his grip warm and strong. His eyes held hers, and when he spoke his voice was firm and absolutely certain. "You will not need that here ever," he said. "I promise you, Sarah, as long as I am around, you will never need to be afraid again. Whatever you are running from, whatever has made you feel like you need to sleep with a weapon within reach, it is over now. I will protect you. I will keep you safe. You have my word on that." The tears spilled over then, running hot down Sarah's cheeks. All the fear and loneliness and exhaustion of the past months came pouring out, and Russell pulled her into his arms, holding her while she sobbed against his chest. He did not ask questions or demand explanations. He just held her, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring quiet reassurances until the storm passed and she could breathe again. When she finally pulled back, wiping at her eyes with trembling hands, he produced a handkerchief and helped her dry her face with such tenderness that she almost started crying again. "I am sorry," she said, her voice hoarse. "I did not mean to fall apart like that." "Do not apologize," Russell said firmly. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Do you want to tell me about it, about what made you so afraid?" Sarah took a shaky breath and nodded. She owed him the truth, this man who had shown her nothing but kindness and respect, who had just promised to keep her safe without even knowing what he was promising to protect her from. They sat on the edge of the bed, the door still open as Russell had promised, and Sarah told him everything. About her father's gambling, about the debts, about finding him dead, about the men who had come looking for payment and made it clear that they would take it out of her one way or another if she did not disappear. About lying on her application to Mrs. Hendricks, about running as far west as she could, about the knife and the fear and the nightmares that still sometimes woke her in the dark. Russell listened without interrupting, his hand holding hers, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm in a gesture of comfort. When she finished, exhausted and empty, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said. "I know that was not easy to share, and I want you to know that none of it changes how I feel about you. Those men, they have no power here. They do not know where you are, and even if they did, they would have to go through me to get to you, and I promise you that will not happen. You are safe, Sarah. You are safe and you are loved, and you do not have to carry this alone anymore." Sarah felt something in her chest unclench, a tension she had been holding for so long she had forgotten it was there. "You still want to be with me, even knowing I lied about my past." "You did not lie," Russell said gently. "You protected yourself, which is entirely different. And yes, I still want to be with you. I want to be with you more than ever if you will have me." Sarah threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will have you. I love you, Russell." "I love you too, Sarah," he said, his arms around her feeling like the safest place in the world. "So much." He kissed her forehead and gently disentangled himself, standing and offering her his hand. "Come on. Let me tuck you in properly, and then I need to leave before Mrs. Hendricks decides I have overstayed my welcome in your room and throws me out into the snow." Sarah laughed, a watery sound but genuine. Russell pulled back the covers for her, and she climbed into bed, feeling like a child being cared for but not minding it. Russell pulled the blankets up and tucked them around her shoulders, then picked up the knife from the dresser. "What do you want me to do with this?" he asked. Sarah looked at it, then at him. "Keep it," she said, "or put it somewhere else. I do not need it anymore." Russell's smile was beautiful. He set the knife on top of the dresser, still within reach if she changed her mind but not under her pillow, then leaned down and kissed her softly. "Sleep well, my love," he said. "Dream of happy things." "I will," Sarah promised and meant it. He left, closing the door softly behind him, and Sarah settled into the bed feeling lighter than air. For the first time since her father's death, she fell asleep without a weapon under her pillow, and she slept deeply and without nightmares, dreaming instead of a tall cowboy with kind eyes and a future that looked bright and full of possibilities. The next evening, Russell took her to supper at the cafe as promised. It was a small establishment but clean and welcoming, with checkered tablecloths and candles on every table. The owner, an Italian woman named Mrs. Rossi, greeted Russell with evident fondness and showed them to a table by the window that looked out onto the snowy Main Street. The meal was delicious, better than anything Sarah had tasted since leaving St. Louis, and the company was even better. Russell was charming and attentive, making her laugh with stories about his early days as a cowboy when he had been green and fumbling, learning through trial and error, and the not always patient instruction of more experienced hands. "I once let an entire herd of cattle wander off while I was supposed to be watching them," he admitted, shaking his head at the memory. "I had fallen asleep in the saddle after working 2 days straight, and when I woke up the sun was rising and the cattle were gone. Took us 3 days to round them all up again, and I thought for sure I was going to get fired. But the foreman, old man named Jack Crawford, he just looked at me and said anyone who works hard enough to fall asleep in the saddle has earned one mistake. After that, though, he made sure I got proper sleep, and I never let it happen again." "You must have seen so much of the country," Sarah said, fascinated. "I have barely been outside of St. Louis until now." "I have been blessed to see a lot," Russell agreed. "From Texas up through New Mexico and Arizona, all over Colorado, into Utah and Wyoming. Every place has its own beauty, its own challenges. But I keep coming back to Colorado and to Telluride specifically. There is something about this place that feels like home in a way nowhere else ever has." "I am starting to feel that way too," Sarah admitted. "When I first arrived, I was so frightened. Everything was so different, so overwhelming. But now I cannot imagine being anywhere else." Russell reached across the table and took her hand. "I am very glad you came here," he said seriously. "I know the circumstances that brought you were terrible, but I cannot help being grateful that they brought you into my life." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I am grateful too, for this place, for Mrs. Hendricks giving me a chance, for you most of all." They lingered over coffee and dessert, reluctant to end the evening. When they finally left the cafe, the night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead. Russell walked her back to the hotel slowly, their hands clasped together, and at the door he kissed her goodnight with a tenderness that made her heart ache in the best possible way. The weeks leading up to Christmas were some of the happiest of Sarah's life. She and Russell spent every possible moment together, and their love deepened into something solid and enduring. Russell was courting her properly, with all the respect and care that implied, and Sarah felt herself blooming under his attention like a flower in the sun. She had never felt so cherished, so valued for who she was rather than what she could provide. Russell asked her opinions and listened to her answers. He supported her when she told him she was saving her wages because she wanted to eventually have her own small business, maybe a dress shop since she was skilled with a needle. He encouraged her friendship with Mary and Catherine, never trying to monopolize all her time even though she would have happily given it to him. And true to his word, she never slept with the knife under her pillow again. It stayed on the dresser for a few weeks, a talisman she did not need but was not quite ready to put away. And then, one day Sarah wrapped it back in its leather covering and placed it at the bottom of her dresser drawer. The nightmares faded, coming less and less frequently, until she could not remember the last time she had woken in fear. On Christmas Eve, Russell asked her to take a walk with him despite the cold and the fresh snow that had fallen that afternoon. They bundled up in their warmest clothes, and he led her to the church at the edge of town. A simple wooden building with a small steeple that held a bell that rang out over the valley on Sunday mornings. The church was lit with candles for the Christmas Eve service, golden lights spilling from the windows onto the snow. But Russell did not lead her inside. Instead, he took her around to the side of the building where they could see out over the valley. The town spread below them with its own scattering of lights, the mountains looming dark and massive against the star-filled sky. "Sarah," Russell said, and there was something in his voice that made her heart start to race. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I know we have not known each other long, only a few months, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of how I feel about you. You are the bravest, kindest, most amazing woman I have ever met, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy." He released one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small box. When he opened it, Sarah saw a ring nestled inside, a simple gold band with a small but beautiful garnet stone that caught the light from the church windows. "It is not much," Russell said, suddenly nervous. "I know you deserve diamonds and emeralds and all sorts of fancy things, but this is what I could afford, and the stone reminded me of your eyes in the lamplight, and I thought—" "It is perfect," Sarah interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "It is absolutely perfect." Russell smiled, relief and joy transforming his face. "Sarah Thompson, will you marry me? Will you let me love you and protect you and build a life with you here in Telluride or wherever else you want to go? Will you be my wife?" "Yes," Sarah said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Russell, I will marry you. I love you so much." Russell let out a whoop of joy that echoed off the mountains and picked her up, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and then with trembling fingers he took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the stone glowing warmly against her skin. They stood there for a long time, holding each other and kissing and making promises about their future, while the church bells began to ring for the Christmas Eve service, and the snow started to fall again, soft and gentle, blanketing the world in white. They were married in February, on a cold, bright day with the sun so brilliant on the snow it hurt to look at it. The wedding was small but perfect, held in the same church where Russell had proposed. Mrs. Hendricks stood up as Sarah's witness, and Jack Crawford, the foreman who had given Russell a second chance all those years ago and who had come to Telluride specifically for the wedding, stood up as Russell's. Sarah wore a dress she had made herself, a beautiful creation of cream silk that she had spent weeks sewing in her spare moments, embroidering delicate flowers around the hem and sleeves. Russell wore his best suit, looking handsome and slightly uncomfortable but so full of joy that Sarah could not stop smiling. Catherine played the piano, and Mary had helped decorate the church with pine boughs and white ribbons. Half the town seemed to have turned out for the ceremony, filling the small church to capacity. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Russell kissed her, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause that made Sarah blush, but also feel profoundly grateful. These people had welcomed her, had accepted her as one of their own, and now they were celebrating her happiness with genuine warmth. The reception was held at the Silver Bell Hotel, Mrs. Hendricks having insisted and refusing to hear any argument. She had prepared a feast with the help of her cook and Mary and Catherine, and the dining room had been transformed with decorations and flowers that must have been brought in from Denver at considerable expense. They danced their first dance as husband and wife to an old waltz played by a fiddle player from one of the saloons, and Sarah felt like she was floating. Russell held her close, his hand warm on her waist, and whispered in her ear, "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, and I am the luckiest man alive." "I am the lucky one," Sarah whispered back. "You saved me, Russell. You gave me my life back." "We saved each other," he said, and kissed her while their guests cheered. They had rented a small house on the outskirts of town, nothing fancy but theirs, with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a parlor and a porch that looked out toward the mountains. Russell had spent weeks getting it ready, fixing the roof and patching holes and building furniture with his own hands. Sarah had sewn curtains and bought supplies and filled it with small touches that made it feel like home. That night, after the reception had wound down and they had said goodbye to the last of their well-wishers, Russell carried Sarah over the threshold of their new home. He set her down gently in the parlor, and they stood there for a moment just looking at each other, the weight and wonder of what they had done settling over them. "Hello, wife," Russell said softly. "Hello, husband," Sarah replied, and felt joy bubble up in her chest. They spent their wedding night discovering each other, learning the geography of shared pleasure and intimacy with tenderness and patience, and an enthusiasm that made them both laugh at their own eagerness. It was nothing like Sarah had feared it might be, nothing like the dark warnings she had heard whispered among women in St. Louis. It was beautiful and right and natural, an expression of the love they had found together. Afterward, lying in Russell's arms with her head on his chest and his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder, Sarah felt a peace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "What is wrong?" Russell asked immediately, concern in his voice. "Nothing is wrong," Sarah assured him. "Everything is right. For the first time in my life, everything is exactly right." Russell kissed the top of her head. "I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure you still feel that way," he promised. And he did. The years that followed were not without challenges. Life in a mining town at the edge of civilization was never easy. There were hard winters when the snow piled so high they could barely get out the door, and supplies ran low, and everyone grew strained and irritable from being cooped up together. There were economic ups and downs as silver prices fluctuated and mines played out. There were accidents and illnesses and all the small and large tragedies that make up human existence. But through it all, Sarah and Russell had each other. Russell continued working as a cattleman, earning a solid reputation that kept him in steady employment. Sarah opened her dress shop in the 2nd year of their marriage, operating out of a small storefront near the general store. Her skill with a needle and her eye for fashion, learned during her more prosperous years in St. Louis, quickly made her the most sought-after seamstress in town. In the fall of 1880, their first child was born, a robust baby boy they named Thomas after Sarah's mother, whose maiden name had been Thomas. Russell was beside himself with joy, handling his son with a combination of reverence and terror that made Sarah laugh. He was a devoted father, spending every free moment with Thomas, taking him on walks strapped to his chest in a carrier Sarah had made, singing him to sleep with old cowboy songs. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Alina, a tiny, delicate thing who had Russell wrapped around her finger from the moment she drew her first breath. And 3 years after that, another son, James, who was as rambunctious and adventurous as his older brother was thoughtful and careful. The house on the edge of town grew crowded and loud and full of love. Sarah's dress shop continued to prosper, and Russell's work remained steady. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and happy, part of a community that felt like family. Sarah sometimes thought about her old life in St. Louis, about the girl she had been when she first arrived in Telluride, frightened and alone with a knife under her pillow. That girl felt like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime. The wounds that girl had carried had healed, leaving scars that were still tender sometimes but no longer defined her. She never heard from the men her father had owed money to, and eventually she stopped looking over her shoulder, stopped starting at unexpected noises. She was Sarah Wade now, wife and mother and businesswoman, secure in the life she and Russell had built together. Russell aged gracefully, the lines around his eyes deepening but his smile as warm as ever. He remained the solid, steady presence he had been from the beginning, the man who had looked at her knife and promised she would never need it again, who had kept that promise every single day since. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Russell took Sarah back to the spot where he had proposed, leaving the children with Mrs. Hendricks for the evening. It was a warm summer night, and they sat on the grass watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Do you remember the first time I saw that knife under your pillow?" Russell asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Of course," Sarah said. "I remember everything about that night. I was so scared you would think less of me, that you would realize I was not worth the trouble." "I never thought that," Russell said firmly. "Not for one second. What I thought was that you were the strongest, bravest person I had ever met, to have gone through what you went through and still be standing, still be trying to build a new life. I fell in love with you that day, completely and irrevocably." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the gray threading through his dark hair, the weathering of sun and wind on his face, the love in his eyes that had never dimmed. "You saved my life," she said quietly. "In every way that matters, you saved my life." "We saved each other," Russell said, echoing what he had said on their wedding day. "You gave me purpose, Sarah. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something permanent. Before you, I was just drifting, going from job to job, place to place. You made me want to stay." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Russell pulled something from his pocket. It was the knife, the one Sarah had not seen in years, had honestly forgotten about. The leather wrapping was worn now, and the blade showed signs of age, but it was still the same weapon she had carried all the way from St. Louis. "I kept this," Russell said. "I know you told me to do whatever I wanted with it, but I kept it. I thought someday we might want to remember where we started, what we overcame to get here." Sarah took the knife from him, feeling the familiar weight of it in her hand. It seemed smaller now than she remembered, less threatening. Just a tool, not a talisman against fear. "Do you know what I want to do with it?" she asked. "What?" "I want to bury it," she said. "Right here in this spot where you proposed. I want to leave it behind, literally put it in the past where it belongs." Russell's smile was beautiful in the fading light. "I think that is a perfect idea." They used a flat stone to dig a small hole in the rocky soil, and Sarah placed the knife inside, covering it carefully. When they were done, Russell laid a larger stone on top to mark the spot, and they stood together, his arm around her waist, looking at this small grave for the fear and pain of the past. "Goodbye to all of that," Sarah said softly. "And hello to everything still to come." "Everything still to come," Russell agreed, and kissed her as the first stars began to shine. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of family life. Thomas grew into a serious young man with his mother's dark eyes and his father's integrity, eventually taking over the day-to-day operations of a small ranch Russell had managed to purchase. Eleanor became a teacher like Catherine, whom she had always admired, and brought a passion for education to the children of Telluride and the surrounding area. James followed his father into cattle work, developing a reputation as one of the best horsemen in Colorado. All three children married and had families of their own, filling Russell and Sarah's later years with grandchildren who climbed on their laps and begged for stories about the old days when Telluride was wild and new. Sarah's dress shop eventually passed to a younger seamstress, and Russell retired from active cattle work, though he still consulted for various ranches. They spent their days in peaceful domesticity, tending the garden Sarah had always wanted, reading together in the evenings, taking walks through a town that had grown and changed but still felt like home. Mrs. Hendricks passed away in 1895, and Sarah wept at her funeral, remembering the stern woman who had given a frightened girl a chance and never asked uncomfortable questions. Mary and Catherine remained close friends throughout the years, and the three women grew old together, meeting for tea every week and watching with satisfaction as the rough mining town of their youth transformed into something more settled and civilized. Russell's hair went completely gray and then white, and his step slowed, but his eyes remained the same hazel that had captivated Sarah that first day in the hotel dining room. He still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, and she still felt her heart flutter when he smiled. On a summer evening in 1910, when Sarah was 62 and Russell was 65, they sat together on the porch of their house watching the sun set behind the mountains they both loved. Their hands were clasped together, fingers intertwined, and they did not need to speak to communicate the depth of feeling between them. "You ever regret it?" Sarah asked finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "Marrying me, staying in Telluride, building this life instead of continuing to drift." Russell turned to her with an expression of such love and contentment that it took her breath away even after all these years. "Not for one single second," he said firmly. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me," Sarah weighed. "You and our children and this life we built together. I would not change a single moment of it." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she said. "I love you so much, and I am so grateful for every day we have had together." "I love you too," Russell said, kissing the top of her head, "now and always." They sat together as the sky turned from gold to rose to purple, watching the stars emerge one by one. And Sarah thought about the girl she had been when she first came to this place, alone and afraid with a knife under her pillow. That girl would never have imagined this life, this abundance of love and family and belonging. Russell had been right all those years ago when he saw her knife and made his promise. She had not needed it, not ever again, because he had given her something infinitely better than a weapon for protection. He had given her trust and love and a safe place to heal, and together they had built something beautiful and enduring. The grandchildren came for Sunday dinner the next day, filling the house with noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of family. Sarah cooked her famous roast chicken while Russell entertained the little ones with stories about the early days of Telluride, when there were more saloons than churches, and you could still see mountain lions in town. Thomas's oldest son, a boy of 12 named Russell after his grandfather, asked Sarah about how she and his grandfather had met. Sarah smiled and exchanged a glance with her husband across the crowded table. "Well," she said, "I came to Telluride a long time ago, scared and alone and not sure what I would find here. And then I met your grandfather, and he showed me that I did not need to be afraid anymore. He taught me that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that home is not a place but the people you choose to share your life with." "That is very romantic, grandmother," Alina's daughter said with a sigh. "It is the truth," Russell said, reaching across the table to take Sarah's hand. "Your grandmother saved my life, just as much as I saved hers. We found each other at exactly the right moment, and we have been blessed with every day since." The children clamored for more details, more stories, and Sarah and Russell obliged, telling edited versions of their early days together, their courtship and marriage, the building of their family and their businesses. They left out the darker parts, the fear and the running and the knife under the pillow, not because they were ashamed, but because those shadows had no place in this bright afternoon, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had created. When the last dish was washed and the last grandchild had been hugged goodbye and sent on their way, Sarah and Russell retired to their bedroom, weary but content. They prepared for bed in the comfortable rhythm of long marriage, and when they lay down together, Russell pulled Sarah close, her back against his chest, his arm around her waist. "Happy," he murmured into her hair. "So happy," Sarah confirmed. "Happy and grateful and so very loved." "Good," Russell said. "That is all I ever wanted for you, for us." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, in the house they had made a home, in the town that had given them a chance to start over, in the life they had built from fear and hope and the courage to trust in love. Sarah Thompson Wade lived to be 82 years old, and Russell Wade lived to be 85. They spent more than 50 years together, and in all that time, through all the challenges and joys and ordinary moments that make up a life, Sarah never once slept with a knife under her pillow again. She did not need it. She had Russell, and Russell had her, and that was more than enough. When Sarah passed away peacefully in her sleep on a spring morning in 1930, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, they found a letter tucked into her Bible addressed to Russell. In it, she had written about their life together, about the night he had seen her knife and promised she would never need it again, about how he had kept that promise every day of their marriage. "You gave me safety," she had written in her elegant script. "But more than that, you gave me the courage to stop being afraid. You taught me that love is stronger than fear, that trust is more powerful than any weapon, and that home is not a place you find but something you build with the person you love. Thank you, my darling Russell, for every moment of our beautiful life together. I will love you forever." Russell had the letter framed and kept it on his bedside table for the remaining 3 years of his life. He would read it every night before going to sleep, and sometimes his children would find him with tears on his weathered face, touching the glass that covered his wife's final words to him. When Russell died in the summer of 1933, the whole town of Telluride turned out for his funeral. He was laid to rest next to Sarah in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley they had both loved, and on his gravestone, beneath his name and dates, his children had inscribed the words he had said to Sarah that night so many years ago. "You will not need that here ever." It was a promise he had kept, and a legacy that lived on in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried his and Sarah's blood, who had learned from their example that love can heal, that fear can be overcome, and that two people who find each other at the right moment can build something that lasts far beyond their own lifetimes. Years later, when the old house on the edge of town was being renovated by new owners, someone found a small marker stone up in the hills behind the property. When they dug beneath it, curious, they found the remains of an old knife wrapped in leather, the blade rusted but still recognizable. No one knew what it was or why it had been buried there, and eventually it was thrown away, returned to the earth where it belonged. The fear it represented was gone, dissolved by years of love and safety, and the kind of happiness that comes from finding exactly the right person at exactly the right time, and having the courage to hold on tight and never let go. Sarah and Russell's love story became part of Telluride's history, told and retold by their descendants, a reminder that even in the roughest places and the hardest times, Love can bloom and flourish and create something beautiful that lasts forever. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the fear that brought Sarah to Telluride or the loneliness that made Russell ready to settle down, but the love they found together and the life they built from it, one day and one choice at a time, until the scared girl with a knife under her pillow transformed into a woman who knew she was safe, not because she had weapons to protect her, but because she had a partner who would stand beside her through anything. That was the real happy ending, not the wedding or the children or the years of prosperity, though all of those things were wonderful. The real happy ending was the moment Sarah realized she did not need the knife anymore, the moment she buried it and walked away hand in hand with the man who loved her, free at last from fear and ready to embrace whatever the future held. And what a beautiful future it turned out to be.